Hello, everyone. Welcome to our community keynote. As you've heard, Bethany Nowviskie can't be with us today. She was chosen as our community keynote because of her importance to us all. And I'm happy to say that someone else who is a huge figure in our community has been selected by Bethany to present the paper to you. So I want to both thank and introduce Melissa Terras, who will give us an introduction to Bethany and an explanation of how this reading is going to go.
That's good. I'm trying to get the slides to work and I can't. So there we go. Hi, I'm Melissa, and I was hoping to introduce Bethany now. As we've heard, Bethany had a death in the family just before she was going to travel to come here. So our thoughts are very much with Bethany. As program chair, which I am this year, we had decided you get the choice when you're program chair to try and do some new things sometimes. And we had decided that one of the things we wanted to do was to introduce another keynote, and that was a community keynote. We have a habit of asking people from outside the community to come to the DH conferences and talk to us about their work, but we decided we wanted someone from the community also to say what they were thinking about the aspects of the community they thought we should consider. So we had a discussion on the program chair, on the PC list, and Bethany was our first choice. I mean, that was it. And Bethany, as many of you know, was program chair last year. She's a central figure in our field. She's responsible for launching the careers of many of the early career scholars around. She is an all-round good person and a wonderful maker of things. Who is Bethany? She is the director of the Digital Research and Scholarship Lab at the University of Virginia Library, and she's also special advisor to the provost at the University of Virginia. She's president at the moment for the Association for Computers and Humanities. She's just outgoing as president there. And she's chair of the General Faculty Council at UVA and also the Modern Language Association's Committee on Information Technology. The Chronicle of Higher Education said Bethany Nowviskie likes to build things. She describes herself as a mother of two, a thinker, and not that kind of doctor. And she was going to give a very brave talk today, and she's asked me to give that brave talk, and of course I am honoured that she chose me. How is it going to work? Bethany cannot even be online at the moment. She's with her family at the moment. She will not be online. She cannot contribute. We can't dial in or anything like that. She asked me to give her talk, and she is immediately going to post her talk on her blog after this. So her blog is set up at 6:30 or whatever to immediately post that on there. She will take any comments on that blog post. She will follow up any comments on Twitter after. But what I'm going to do now is I am going to read the talk as Bethany wrote it. So once I put the hat on for Bethany, when I say I, it's Bethany who's speaking. She didn't want me to change anything, and we agreed that's the way. There is a point halfway through the talk where I'm going to find it very difficult not to turn into Melissa. I will clearly signal that because I have to do a little happy dance at something that she shows. But I will make it clear when that is. So when I say I actually mean Bethany. So are we all ready? This is a spirit of mutual warmth and appreciation. I'm going to try this out, and we're going to jump right into Bethany's talk, Digital Humanities in the Anthropocene. And by, Christopher Robin came to an end of the things and was silent. And he sat there, looking out over the world and wishing it would not stop. Every morning, as the Virginia sun spills over the rim of the Shenandoah Valley, I dive into the water of my municipal swimming pool and think of ruined Roman baths. On either end of the lane in which I take my laps are blue tile letters, mortared just beneath the waterline by a craftsman of the century gone by. I read two words as I swim back and forth: shallow and deep, shallow and deep, shallow and deep. I'm here to give a talk that likewise wants to glide from shallows to depths in turn. My hope is to position our work, The work of the Digital Humanities community that has nurtured me with kindness for some 18 years, less as it is lately figured, that is, less as a fragmenting set of methodological interventions in the contemporary disciplinary agon of humanities scholarship, and more as one cohesive and improbably hopeful possibility. The possibility is for strongly connecting technologies and patterns of work in the humanities to deep time, both to times long past and far away in prospect. But I'll swim to the shallows too, because by musing about the messages we may attempt to send and receive in the longest of longue durée, I also mean to encourage a searching and an active stance in digital humanities towards our present moment, towards engagement with the technological, environmental, and ethical conditions of our vital here and now. I promised in my abstract a practitioner's talk, and that is what you'll get. I'm not a philosopher or a critic. I'm a builder and a caretaker of systems, so I will attempt to bring a craftsperson's perspective to my theme tonight. To make plain the premise on which this talk rests, I take as given the scientific evidence that human beings have irrevocably altered conditions for life on our planet. I acknowledge too that our past actions have a forward motion, that we owe what ecologists like David Tillman call an extinction debt, and that this debt will be paid. As the frequency of disappearance of species leaps from its background rate by 100 to 1,000 times the average, I accept, despite certain unpredictabilities but with no uncertain horror, that we stand on the cusp of a global mass extinction of plants and animals on the land and in our seas. We are here to live for a moment as best we can, to do our work and to help our fellow travellers muddle through their own short spans of time. But we are also possessed of a knowledge that is sobering and rare. We and the several generations that follow us will bear knowing witness to the sixth great extinction of life on Earth. This is an ending of things, a barring of doors, not seen since the colossal dying that closed the Mesozoic era 66 million years ago. What does that knowledge do to digital humanities in 2014? What does it do to our self-conception as humanities computing practitioners? It is certainly a reminder of common ground and shared fate. Can it speak to us as increasingly loosely coupled guilds of scholars working across disciplines, as archivists and librarians, as guardians and interpreters of cultural heritage? Can it speak to us as technologists, developers, and specialists in method and form, as researchers, administrators, students, and shapers and makers of all kinds? What responsibilities for the DH community does this knowledge imply? What outlooks come more sharply into view? I don't believe I'll fully answer these questions over the course of the next 40 to 45 minutes. Most of all, I mean to ask them and to use them to draw together a kind of toolkit for the years to come. So allow me to pose a few more questions and to outline my talk in brief before I really begin. Tonight, I'll ask you to take to heart the notion that, alongside the myriad joyful, playful, scholarly, and intellectual concerns that motivate us in the digital humanities, or rather, resting beneath them all as a kind of substrate, there lies the seriousness of one core problem. The problem is that of extinction, of multiple extinctions, heartbreaking extinctions, boring, quotidian, barely noticed extinctions, both the absences that echo through the centuries and the disposable erosions of our lossy everyday. We edit to guess at a poet's papers long since burned in the hearth. We scraped through stratigraphic layers of earth to uncover ways of life forgotten and piece together pot shards to make our theories about them hold water. Some of us model how languages change over time and train ourselves to read the hands that won't be written anymore. Others promulgate standards to wards against isolation and loss. With great labor and attention, we migrate complex systems forward. We redesign our websites and our tools, or abandon them, or, more rarely, we consciously archive and shut them down. DHers peer with microscopes and macroscopes, looking into things we cannot even see. And even while we delight in building the shiny and the new, and come to meetings like this to celebrate and share and advance that work, we know that someone, sooner or later, curates bits against our ruins. What is a digital humanities practice that grapples constantly with little extinctions and can look clear-eyed out on a big one? Is it socially conscious and activist in tone? Does it reflect the managerial and problem-solving character of our 21st century institutions? Is it about preservation, conservation and recovery, or about understanding ephemerality and embracing change? Does our work help us to appreciate, memorialize, and mourn the things we've lost? Does it alter for us and for our audiences, our global frameworks and our sense of scale? Is it about teaching ourselves to live differently? Or, as the soldier of a desert war wrote in last autumn's New York Times, is our central task the task of learning how to die? Not as he put it, to die as individuals, but as a civilization in the Anthropocene. My plan for this evening is first to spend a bit of time defining the concept of the Anthropocene and sharing some key ways it has been discussed by scholars and has entered the public consciousness. I'll identify two broad categories of popular and scholarly response to notions of deep time, extinction, and decline, and I'll introduce them by way of the provocations of two groups, twinned groups, made up of poets and scientists, philanthropists and preppers, scholars, technologists, artisans, and storytellers. These are the Long Now Foundation and Dark Mountain. I'll then tell, but not necessarily explicate, two small stories. My stories are about contemplating time by building for time, focusing on the problem of communication across millennia. They come from fascist architecture and the post-war field of nuclear semiotics. Finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts on the intersection of digital humanities methods, systems, projects, and values with these larger concerns. I'll identify a few things that the DH community in particular may be positioned to do, to enable and to give. Is everybody with me now? Well, let's go on. We like to toy with terms that might encapsulate our growing sense of responsibility towards and entanglement with the natural world. If human beings have become a geophysical force capable of impacting the very crust and atmosphere of the planet, and if geophysical forces become objects of study, presence is able to be charted over millions of years, one of our problems is a naming problem. In 1992, journalist Andrew Revkin made a prediction. Earth sciences of the future, he said, will name this new post-Holocene period for its causative element, for us. We are entering an age that might someday be referred to, say, the Anthropocene. After all, it is a geological age of our own making. In fact, an alternative form of the word Anthropocene, coined by the biologist Eugene Sturmer in the 1980s, won out, having been popularized through the early 2000s by Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Crutzen. In 2008, the Stratigraphy Commission of the Geological Society of London took up the question of whether the Anthropocene should become official nomenclature, resting alongside the Pleistocene and Holocene in a system of chronology that measures not spins around the sun, but geologic time, the complex chemical, elemental, magnetic, and other biophysical signals we glean from layers of rock. Work that only UTEI folks in the audience can truly appreciate remains underway among the relevant international standards bodies. One point of disagreement and discussion rests in where exactly far-future geologists and alien paleontologists might drive the Anthropocenic delimiter, a marker that, for rockhounds of our day, is literally a golden spike. Will they detect the startling isotopic signature of 20th century atomic bombs, evident in all of our teeth and bones? Will they note chemical and mineral traces, acid and soot, or coal miners' physical perturbations of the earth dating to the Industrial Revolution? Or will the Anthropocene begin in the microscopic fossil record of the spread of agriculture some 8,000 to 10,000 years ago? Who knows? It's all in the blink of an eye, and we'll be long gone. But the idea of the impact of humans on the natural world is marked and measurable, so much so it might be named, is not particularly new. In 1873, the Italian geologist and priest Antonio Stoppani suggested that our technologies, infrastructures, and patterns of land had used a creative fundamental changes in Earth systems, propelling us into what he called an Anthropozoic era. Stupani's concept was quickly picked up by George Perkins Marsh in a revised edition of his 1864 ecological treatise, Man and Nature, retitled straightforwardly, The Earth as Modified by Human Action. R.L. Sherlock's 1922 volume, Man as a Geologic Agent, offers an early warning of global anthropogenic climate change due to excessive use of fossil fuels, which, as the foreword to the book puts it, will surely result in an unwelcome change in man's atmospheric surroundings. This should prompt him to pause to consider whether his use and alteration of the crust of the earth itself are for future as well as for present advantage. I'm charmed that Sherlock is able to present such a prescient warning. At the same moment, he can also entertain lessons offered us by a declining civilization on Mars. The Martians are introduced as our elderly near neighbours whose battle with nature has been on a much more gigantic scale than man's conflict, and whose wasted, arid planet is branded with the futile engineering works of the Great Canals. But most of all, I wanted to pause to introduce this book to you because it touches on themes to which we will all return. First, this cheerful sentiment. Truly it would seem as if man strews the earth with ruin, but this conclusion is too flattering to human vanity. Man's most permanent memorial is a rubbish heap, and even that is doomed to be obliterated. Ladies and gentlemen, geology. I won't actually gloss this bleak passage right now, but I want to point out that depressing you so deeply is my way of making sure I'm never on the big stage at a Digital Humanities conference again. I'll be an ancient old lady one day in the running for a Busa Award, and someone will say, yes, but you remember Nowviskie at Lausanne? We will return later on to the notion of the obliteration of our most permanent memorials. A second quotation is the one I'll build from immediately. Sherlock, interested in the whimsical burst of human influence seen against the usually more continuous sweep of nature, writes, perhaps the most difficult and at the same time the most interesting problem that arises is the relation between man's psychology and his geological activities. His most profound interferences with nature have their origin in his thoughts. Above all, the intellectual uses to which the Anthropocene label is currently put by 21st century climate scientists, historians, and eco-critics, by philosophers, politicians, activists, and artists, have to do with this relation called out in 1922, the relation between the changeable psychology of people, on the one hand, and the practices that lead to their geologically detectable activities on the other. You know our contemporary battles around climate science well and understand their stakes, so I will not rehearse them here, except to recommend to you the substantive work of our opening speaker, Bruno Latour, who meditates in a number of places on the Anthropocene as a concept powerful enough to challenge the long-standing philosophical separation of humans from nature and to jar us from a curiously modern political paralysis. But more tonight than in conceptions of the tenuous relations to politics of reasons, I am interested in the rhetorical, technological, aesthetic, and deeply personal, sometimes even sentimental struggles brought into focus by the Anthropocene and how they prompt us to position the work of the digital humanities in time. Let's frame these struggles with a tale of two collectives. The first is the California-based Long Now Foundation, which has undertaken an ambitious, interconnected set of projects meant to promote long-term thinking, very long-term thinking. The Long Now was established in 1996 by Stuart Brand, the hippie Whole Earth Catalogue editor and the founder of Well, by computer scientist Danny Hillis, and by experimental musician Brian Eno, among others. In fact, members of the Long Now would have me say it was founded in the year 01996, a way of writing dates that presently accommodates a further 97,985 years. To put this into perspective, 50,000 years before the Long Now runs out of digits, Niagara Falls will have eroded its remaining 32 kilometres to Lake Erie. That communion will occur a full 30,000 years after, according to one lexical statistical model, the point at which human languages will have retained only 1% of their present-day words. By the time the Long Now has a year 100K problem, the constellations you recognise will be gone from the sky. I'll lay this out to make the point that Long Now folks embed a puckishly provocative optimism in everything they do. but most of their efforts target the more modest timescale of 10,000 years, about the length of human civilization thus far. Among the best known of these is the Rosetta Project, a scheme to gather up and document over 2,500 human languages, some 13,000 page images of which have been microscopically etched onto pretty 4-inch nickel discs. A gigantic, imperceptibly moving Clock of the Long Now, another project, is currently being installed deep inside a mountain in West Texas, with a duplicate planned for the Nevada desert to be planted under a grove of 5,000-year-old bristlecone pines. Brian Eno designed the clock's combinatoric system of chimes, a mechanical computer that will ring out 3.5 million different melodies over the centuries. Why would anyone build a clock inside a mountain with the hope that it will ring for 10,000 years right along now? The answer, just so that people will ask this question. Their latest venture is a chic San Francisco bar, a library, and a salon for conversations about long-term thinking. There are TED Talks. Contrast this with the Dark Mountain Project, founded in 2009 by Dougald Hine and Paul Kingsnorth, a couple of 30-something British writers and disillusioned environmental activists who crowd-funded the printing of a manifesto. Their pamphlet, inspired by the American poet of Inhumanism Robinson Jeffers, was titled Uncivilization. It urged readers to look not to the far future, but steadily on our present moment of material contraction, ecological collapse, and civilization of decline, with an eye toward the dissolution and final failure of deeply ingrained myths of progress. What comes after the end of the world, they asked. And if the stories we've told ourselves about dominion over nature, manifest destiny, liberty and advancement and ease are the things that brought us to the state, what kind of storytelling can usher in a new way of life? Dark Mountains speaks not to policymakers and to technocrats, but to writers and artists, asking them to drop all pretense about the perfectibility of our technologies and our capacity to stave off disaster, and instead use their craft to help audiences come to terms with, quote, the unraveling of the world. Uncivilization struck a nerve, and it wasn't long until an annual compilation of writing appeared alongside several summers of open-air festivals held in Hampshire and Wales. Dark Mountain has pulled back on carnivalesque events, but nonetheless makes the news now with increasing frequency and publishes 2 print books a year. I read them at the beach. I introduce these groups to you now, Dark Mountain and Along Now, as a kind of shorthand for 2 classes of scholarly conversation that they in fact really cite or engage with, but of which they still seem a part. Maybe it's the zeitgeist, something in the air. They're a way for me tonight to orient and condense the scholarship that informs our theme. So bear with me for a moment through a little lit review. I'm kitting out a toolkit we will need. So, Long Now and Dark Mountain. They're not exactly deep time versus the ephemeral and experiential, nor are they exactly about careful manufacturer and how the machine stops. They're not neatly about hope versus despair either. But when in an edited collection on post-environmentalism and the Anthropocene, Latour urges us to love our monsters, that is, to take a page from Frankenstein here, on the shores of Lake Leman, and invest in more systematic management of the technologies we have created, when he tells us that hope lies in putting as much care into the stewardship of our disquieting tech as we put into its creation, it's a call for long-term thinking and a constructive continuing long now. The environment, Latour writes, should be even more managed, taken up, cared for, stewarded, in brief, integrated and internalized in the very fabric of the polity. On the other hand, when technology governance expert Stephen J. Jackson submits, in a recent essay called Rethinking Repair, that we require broken world thinking, he's on the slopes of the Dark Mountain. Jackson holds that individual acts of maintenance, disassembly and repair are ever present in our interaction with technology as quietly hopeful and generative deeds, but that they are occluded by a privileged cultural rhetoric of innovation, development and design. He calls for more thoughtful engagement with the notion not so much of making things, but of fixing them, repurposing them in their diminishment and dismantlement, not of making new, but of making do, and of therefore engaging what he calls the ethics of mutual care with each other, the world around us, and with the quite literal objects of our affection. This is a source, he says, of hope and resilience, and it's a way of being in space and time that has deep feminist roots. The post-colonial eco-criticism of Canadian scholar Susie O Brien similarly advances an agenda of empathy, but complicates Jackson's lauding of resilience, manifested in acts of repair. Her recent paper, The Downside of Up, and a later piece on edge work and resilience theory in Arundhati Roy show how comfortably the concept of resilience, of bouncing back, of being flexible and adaptable as a measure not just of ecological fitness, but as a kind of moral worthiness, has aligned with the ideas of neoliberalism. Constantly volatility, strategic dynamism, deregulation, and the consequent dismantling of environmental and social welfare programs. Today, we seek resilient cities, resilient infrastructure, resilient employees. It's a seductive term. But reflect how easily, as Mackenzie Walk writes in a recent post on Heidegger and geology, resilience becomes government under conditions of constant apocalypse, something to be endured. What would constitute a resilient digital humanities? And do we really want to know? Historian Dipesh Chakrabarti, in a pivotal article called The Climate of History, argued that the Anthropocene unsettles received notions of freedom and emancipation. These are deeply embedded in Enlightenment and post-colonial narratives that continue to shape our institutions and technologies for good and ill, those very myths of progress and ease against which Dark Mountain calls for countertales. Liberty is an intellectual framework, he says, that was thoughtlessly energy-intensive, that overlooked its own costs. Marisa Parham of the 5 Colleges Digital Humanities Consortium never references Chakrabarti, but sees these costs instantly in the transatlantic slave trade when she looks at a historical data visualization created by D.H.R. Benschmidt, a visualization the popular press latched onto and labelled a map of 19th century shipping routes and nothing else. Parham's beautifully nuanced short post is called Black Haunts in the Anthropocene. Aileen Christ, who works in animal studies, objects to the very concept. Her essay on the poverty of our nomenclature attacks the egocentrism of the Anthropocene label. For Christ, the one conceptual freedom, naming the era for ourselves, denies is the freedom to disengage, radically and voluntarily, to scale back our human presence. Similarly, Brian Lennon, who considers ecological questions in the framework of scholarly labour, suggests we resist by understanding time as the medium of humanities research. Insofar as time itself, I quote, brings all worldly striving to extinction. There we go. Time is therefore the thing we should protect and conserve. The freedoms we imagine for digital scholarship, Lennon writes, are in the end perhaps merely productive efficiencies. To address the ecological impasse we now face is not to demand some productive new critical theoretical innovation so much as some restraint of mechanized production. This would constitute a needed re-evaluation of ourselves as we are accustomed to work. To take a final look at the themes arising through the Long Now and Dark Mountain, I'll return to one of the questions with which I began. What does it mean, I ask you, to witness mass extinction, the end of so much worldly striving? What could or should it mean to us or motivate us to do? John C. Ryan, a scholar of the cultural history of Australian flora, emphasises emotional and aesthetic losses, which he says have only been minimally articulated in the scientific literature. All those colours, sounds, smells, behaviours and relations, the absence of which leave our sense worlds impoverished. If it's true, as the Indian anthropologist Shiv Visvanathan has written, science has no mourning rituals, then Ryan might well seek consolation in poetic inquiry alongside botany. But this, he writes, requires a real framework and actual modalities for mourning, a productive aesthetic in the truest sense of Dark Mountain, the development of which could be a special task for the digital and environmental humanities in our time. Tom Van Duren and Deborah Rose of the Extinction Studies Working Group agree. This is a group, by the way, that includes Professor Donna Haraway, who more commonly appears in DH talks as a cyborg rather than a goddess. Rose and Van Doren take on the final Long Now project I'll mention in a sharp presentation made last year to the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales. Like Ryan, they see our primary cultural task as simply to grieve. In their words, to dwell with extinction, because grief changes us. And only deeply profound internal change will create the foundations of a sustainable and informed response. Van Doren and Rose are responding to Revive and Restore, the Long Now's new effort to coordinate a de-extinction movement. This project supports the genetic engineering of an endangered species, altering them physically to become more resilient in the Anthropocene, and the cloning and wholesale recreation of extinct ones, passenger pigeons, woolly mammoths, work that founder Stuart Brand promotes as genetic rescue. Revive and Restore is entirely different in character from the Long Now's Rosetta Disc and Clock projects, which originated almost 2 decades ago. It is not about an aesthetic provocation to more careful long-term thinking, but rather about doing something, maybe anything, right now. In a TED Talk last year, Brand posed the question of how the history of human-driven extinction of animals makes us feel, and how it is that we ought to orient ourselves in relation to it. Van Doren and Rose quote the talk, "Sorrow, anger, mourning," said Brand. "Don't mourn," he said, "organize." I watched it. "Well," he whips at the crowd, "do you want extinct species back? Do you want extinct species back?" And they burst into applause. Oops, sorry. There we go. Perhaps we have been cautious enough of the unintended results of our technological solutions to look concernedly on a de-extinction project, on the careless creation, one might fear, of too many monsters to love. Simply dwelling with extinction, though, in the dark mountain sense, seems profoundly bleak and potentially without end. What are we left with? Let me hang 2 masks on the wall. Both are apotopaic. Mask the first. The strange speculative subfield of nuclear semiotics came into being in 1981 when the US government and the Bechtel Corporation, builders of the Hoover Dam, commissioned a task force. Its goal was to diminish the likelihood that over the course of the next 10,000 years, some unlucky band of human descendants would blunder into a planned underground repository for radioactive waste. 2 major reports emerged from this effort. The first, authored by the linguist and semiotician Thomas Sebowick, is famous for proposing the creation of an atomic priesthood, a hieratic cult that would be devoted to protecting and transmitting knowledge about the site. A later group's 1993 report includes sketches of threatening-looking earthworks, a jagged field of thorns, Rosetta Stone warnings, sad-face pictures, and so forth. Their proposed signs and structures were meant to be clear. This is not a place of honor. Don't dig here. But of course, what could be more enticing to future archaeologists than an utterly unique, monumental, and terrifying ruin of the lost civilizations of the Americas? An architecture of admonition seems doomed to fail. More imaginative than the official reports was a special issue of the Germans. I'm not going to read the title of that journal, sorry, there's a German journal title, which, inspired by the project, made a call for alternate proposals and published a cluster of them in 1984, including a short piece by Sebowick. Berlin's Felix Sontag proposed to put the message somewhere safe, on the face of an artificial moon. The Polish sci-fi writer Stanislaw Lem suggested that information about the site be encoded in the DNA of flowers planted in the earth above. But 2 French researchers, Bastide and Fabry, win the Dark Mountain Prize. They proposed the creation of a breed of cats, Strahlenkatze, whose fur would change colour when exposed to lingering radioactivity. Storytellers, artists, and songwriters would be recruited to seed in every culture everywhere a viral set of fables and legends about the bad things that happen when your kitten turns blue. The collection closed with 2 essays by Suzanne Hauser and Marshall Blonsky, sharply suggesting that effort might be better spent on disarmament and reduction of nuclear waste in the first place, and stating that the question itself, perhaps like this talk, reflects a condition in which a disintegrating, late capitalist society seduces its elite into projecting its own insecurity on the future of mankind. Second mask. In 1934, Adolf Hitler asked his state architect, Albert Speer, to design a permanent structure to replace the wooden tribunal at a Zeppelin landing field in Nuremberg, the place that was to become the infamous Nazi Party rallying grounds. Speer knew Hitler was inspired by classical architecture and jealous that the ruins dotting Italy suggested a certain continuity of Mussolini's regime with the great empire of Rome. Perhaps himself inspired by a painting commissioned by 19th century architect Sir John Soanes of the then new Bank of England, you see that behind me, Speer ultimately presented Hitler with more than one image of the finished building. He offered a second sketch of the Zeppelin field, 1,000 years hence, ruined, ivy-covered, yet recognisable, and perhaps lying in wait to inspire a Fourth Reich to come. His ministers were scandalised at the architect's memento mori, but Hitler loved it, and Speer later developed and described the idea as a theory of ruin value, henceforth taking care only to use building materials that would crumble picturesquely. I offer this, like the irradiated Strahlenkatze of nuclear semiotics, as an instance of our common drive to communicate across millennia, whether we grasp the fact or not, that what we speak may be our darkest sin. And perhaps that explains all our human striving towards a label for the Anthropocene, the hope against hope that we will leave material traces, even knowing that so many are traces of transgression. Maybe it's also why, in a recent talk on retreating from academic turf wars to turf itself, the Finnish media theorist Jussi Parikka reminds us that the materiality of modern infotech sinks its common roots deep below in toxic metals in the earth. Given all this, the broader scientific, historical, and speculative lenses through which we view ourselves in time, and the climate of extinction that surrounds our work, what are our best shared hopes for digital humanities? What tasks and projects might we take up or tie in? What are our functions, or, if you prefer, our vocations now? I want us to use the seriousness of this moment to draw ourselves together with compassion, solidarity, and smarts, as an international, multidisciplinary, and self-consciously interprofessional community, mindful of everyday extinctions and of the complexities of contending with them, cautious of the darker sides and callings of our drive to communicate in deep time, and yet filled with benevolence and hope. Sorry, gone too fast. Back. There we go. I think we have a reason for hope and for a confidence in our gifts. I'll spend my last minutes with you enumerating some of the more important of these, both our successes and places where we're still scoping out needed work. And forgive me for not associating individual names with the bulk of the projects I'll allude to. In typical DH style, most are team-based, some crossing institutional and national borders. First, sorry, this will not play. Back, there we go. Here we go. Let me try and get this video playing. If I go back one more time. Go there. There we are. Nah. Anyway. Here we are. I'm in the right place now. And this is where I take off the hat and go, this is my project. She's talking about my project. Here. This is me. Anyway, Great Parchment Book. So if you Google Great Parchment Book, you'll get to the website. Now, Bethany's hat back on. First, the digital recovery of texts, objects, and traces of human experience through long since lost to time. Here, from the outside at least, digital humanities accomplishments look magical. From the Great Parchment Book of 1639, a brutal wad since the Guildhall fire over 2 centuries ago, and now unfolded virtually and legibly again to the Herculaneum papyri, last unfurled on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius and flash-fried into charcoal briquettes in AD 79, slowly opening themselves up through X-ray, micro-CT, and multispectral scanning. Projects in prosopography give us a stronger sense of common lives from the Byzantine world to the 19th century, while computer-assisted approaches to paleography become ever more deeply humanistic and hermeneutic in character. We simulate and model, calculating, say, the way that light fell into a long-gone Roman villa on a winter's day, or seeking lost cities by reading Homer's Iliad through GIS. And we explore our recent past with media, archaeology, and forensics done on born digital resources, activities which themselves inform steady advances in the field of digital preservation. Resurrection can be grisly work. I think we come to understand extinction better in our own struggles. Back. Forward. Stay. Thank you. Next, big data and the longue durée. If it's true, as Rebecca Solnit writes, that people are bad at looking at the biggest things, in this, our age of inhuman scale, a concept Timothy Morton theorizes through hyper-objects, ineffable natural and computational entities like global warming, massively distributed in time and space, then digital humanities has a public and transformative role to play. For Morton, grappling with hyper-objects can lead to a new time of sincerity, that is, a time in which it is impossible to achieve a final distance towards the world. Jo Gildy gets at this when she narrates how information won't and will save the climate, describing her meetings with a dozen grassroots mappings efforts in India and calling for an information architecture stamped with participation and informed by history. Mapping code and data collection, she writes, must be allied to a sense of memory. It is a powerful reminder to those of us positioned to pit data design and visualization against what Gouldy calls information overload, the corruption of privilege, and the inefficacy of expertise. David Armitage joins Gouldy in another essay, historicizing the recent narrowing of temporal scope by Anglophone academic historians, and describing how advances in distant reading and mass digitization make a return to the longue durée, the title of their article available in both French and English, not only technologically feasible, but politically imperative and deeply restorative for the humanities writ large. But picturing histories anew will require us to go beyond big data, algorithmic analysis and visualization. If we seek a rich and humanistic digital humanities capable of meeting more than the technical challenges of our massive geo-temporal datasets, we must develop design approaches that address recent theoretical mergings of background and foreground, of space and time. The Neatline project at the Scholars Lab is one such attempt, though only half complete. Key here will be embedding in our tools concepts like Joanna Drucker's graphesis to enable knowledge production through iterative visualization, and affordances that support Nick Misrov's call for a counter-visuality to the dominant imagery of the Anthropocene. Mirzov locates the seeds of that resistance in the global south. Or maybe we need a counterfactuality, room for those, quote, strange loops and hybrid products of what-if thinking that form the subject of Carrie Krause's forthcoming book, Hopeful Monsters, an attempt to reorient the historically minded humanities towards possible and positive futures. Experimental humanities labs and digital humanities makerspaces participate in this forward-facing reorientation, allowing scholars to tinker and build, bringing critical perspectives to the realms of 3D fabrication, do-it-yourself wearable and embedded computing, hardware hacking, modding and repair, augmented reality, and the making of bots and games. After all, as Armitage and Gouldy argue in their case for the longue durée, alternative futures become the purview of futurists and science fiction writers only when historians gave up the field. There are further projects we might undertake individually and collectively in the framework of the Anthropocene. I'll close with a fragmentary list. DHers need more effective communication with broader publics to bring our own work in preservation, speculative computing, and cultural memory into the light, and to foster collaborations with people outside the academy who share our orientations and concerns. We need systems of reward that don't just build the new, but find nobility in activities like metadata enhancement, project maintenance, and forward migration, and therefore prompt us to attend to the working conditions of our colleagues in cultural heritage institutions and those who steward digital humanities software and systems. We need more agendas of empathy and to create safe and welcoming spaces for the vulnerable, wherever we can make them. And here I want to pause to express thanks to my LADHUL colleagues and working members who helped me to craft an important new code of conduct for this conference. We need greater attention to matters of accessibility and minimal computing, and cognizance that the so-called global revolution in humanities technology is not equally distributed. We need to acknowledge the imperatives of graceful degradation, So we run fewer geriatric teenage projects that have blithely denied their own mortality and failed to plan for altered or diminished futures. But alongside that, and particularly in libraries, we require a robust discourse around ephemerality, in part to license the experimental works we absolutely want and need, which never mean to live long, get serious, or grow up. We must attend to the environmental and human costs of digital humanities, from our complicity with device manufacturers and social media manipulators to the carbon footprint and price tag of conferences like this, and ask ourselves seriously what we might change or grow to be. As our governments employ military surveillance techniques against common citizens and plan for climate change-induced civil unrest, we must bring our technologically savvy and deep historical conscience more squared into the politics of 21st century life. And we may, sorry, need another slide now. Here we go. And we may need to dwell with extinction, each of us, professionally and privately, just a little more than I have forced us to tonight. It's too much, though, is it not? It's daunting and immobilizing, my list of things we must and need to do when we are doing so much already and in straitened circumstances. But we are many, and more people with our diverse interests gravitate towards the digital humanities every single day. In our age of inhuman scale, I am reminded of a night I spent a few years ago hanging out in the congenial darkness of a New York City park with members of the Occupy Wall Street movement. The crowd was huge and lacked a permit for amplified sound. So when there was news to share, occupiers employed what they called the human mic, or the people's microphone, vocally repeating and therefore amplifying one speaker's words with hundreds of voices and lungs. It's a grassroots approach not unlike the lovely idea of the whispering translations here at DH 2014. We have many smart messengers for the imperatives I put forth tonight. Not all of them work in words, but they're speaking nonetheless. One goal of our collective in the coming years, in times that are getting harder and in service to the world that comes next, could simply be to amplify their voices with everything we have. I finished writing this talk, but I didn't know how to stop, so I went to take a swim. Shallow and deep, the blue tile letter said, at the ends of the lane I always choose. Maybe you like to splash about too. I kick off from one word and stretch my hands out towards the other, back and forth, again and again, while my swimming pool lasts. Thank you very much. I think the context in which I deliver that talk frames it in a very strong manner. And obviously I cannot take questions now, but we certainly can have a discussion. It raises a lot of big questions about the nature of our discipline, ephemerality, and where we hope to plan and go with both what we do as persons and what we hope to do in the digital realm. So I wonder if anyone's got anything. We've got 10 minutes that we can have discussions if you want to raise anything that came up in that talk, if we can have a discussion about some of the issues. Everyone's... We have a microphone. Oh, sorry, over there.
Given how much there is about all these huge collections coming on and all this new data being created, might there be something in creative destruction saying, hey, there's just too much stuff. If we're keeping producing at the rate things are being produced now, in 100 years, good luck. And actually having some misarchiving or non-archiving of stuff might actually be productive for future humanists?
I think absolutely, and this is where we need to talk to our digital curation colleagues. I know that it's not 100 years that we're going to run out of space. I know that in about 10 years' time, the whole of global GDP will have to be deployed to look after all our digital data if it keeps growing at the rate it's growing. It's a short-term thing, that the problems of that, what we choose to discard, what we choose to keep. And at the moment, we are still in an age where we are gleefully making and creating a building, and we haven't thought yet about the complexities, especially when it's expensive to create that data, if it's okay to throw it away, and there are going to be harsh choices ahead. Anyone else got any thing that they would respond to that with? That's very much my impression of it. Yes. We've got a microphone, sorry, so that we can pick it up on the recording.
After that talk, I don't really want to sound like an optimist, but in response to the comment and to your somewhat surprising addendum to it, I would just remind you that in the United States, in about 100 years ago, there was a very major concern, because at the then current growth of the telephone, all of the women in America within 10 years' time would be employed putting little plugs into switchboards. It didn't happen.
Yeah. Counter.
Can anybody throw any light on some kind of reports to which I can't even quote chapter and verse at the moment, that completely new technology for storage of data is under research using not the silicon chip or anything like it, but DNA molecules. Apparently, a cup full of DNA molecules, so it can store as much data as all the Google servers put together. There was some initial research in this direction, in fact, in an institute near my own city of Calcutta. Then the researchers were passed to the United States. Can anybody throw any light on possible further development in this direction?
I'm attempting to throw some lightness into the proceedings and suggest we have cats. Maybe we could breed cats that did that, just like the warning cats. We could have cats that we could store our things on. But yes, it's a serious, there are a lot of people pursuing molecular computation and how we can use that as storage. So yeah, maybe we can keep everything. Maybe we don't have to throw everything away. Maybe we just need to do it differently. But what voice do we need as a community within that framework and within that structure to help it? Is there a relationship we can have with the people developing that technology? Do we have that relationship just now? Obviously not with anyone in the room, but any other points? I'm seeing people kind of tentatively put their hand up and then going, no. I'm sure Bethany didn't, or maybe she did mean to depress us so thoroughly that we would be turned to drink. But that's what's going to happen next. If there's no other comments, we will go and we will go out there and we will toast Bethany, and we'll toast Bethany and her family, and we will thank her for this speech. And thank you all for sitting so quietly and so horrified through a lot of what we had to say. Thank you very much.